And a very good morning if you're in the UK. It's just after 7 o'clock, about 10 past 7, 8 past 7, sorry about that. Get out of bed right now. And for those in Australia, in Victoria, they're having I think New South too, a public holiday, lazy sods. In Queensland, it was a normal Monday, but we're just all heading off home, except for me. Today we're going to talk about, let's talk about the Middle East, but I think it's very important. I think the ramifications are going to be, what can I say, except a disaster unless we have a solution quickly. Because the Middle East moves precariously towards an apocalypse that now threatens everyone around the globe. Having brought us to the edge, do we trust the people in charge to bring us back? Of course not. Donald Trump has doubled down. Big, beautiful bombs, bombing Iran's civilian and critical infrastructure. No longer concerned about the people he pledged to liberate. Trump's leadership has been dealt a fatal blow, no matter what happens. The rogue state of Iran, which may become even more rogue, has replaced the murdered supreme leader with his son. Incredible. I mean, this is just if you saw this on Homeland when the show was out, you'd say that's just too far fetched. And look at it; it's reality, and we're up to our neck in this reality. Is this a win for America, with his son being the new, supreme leader, and Israel? I think not. The Arab states who hosted US bases now face a world of pain. Did they do enough to avoid the Armageddon? Can they save themselves and their oil and gas production by booting the Americans out? Donald Trump says he wants it all because he's the king of the universe. So where are the adults who can pull us back from this terrible brink, the Armageddon that we're looking at, the apocalypse? Does London still hold the key to the Straits of Hormuz? Someone should say no to Donald and Bibi. I wonder who. Now, our panel today, Robbie Barwick, National Chairman of the Australian Citizens Party, Vicky Price, Economic Advisor, and Bernie de Heldervang, Direct Democracy campaigner, enjoying the sunshine, but it's a bit early. I think it's 2 a.m. at the moment in Florida. So good on you, Bernie. You need a tan, by the way. Thanks for joining us. Robbie, can you tell me just a quick minute or 2-minute appraisal of where we're at, and really look at the energy this time, the oil, because if you follow the news in Australia or anywhere, farmers are going to run out of diesel. They can't deliver product and produce to the major populace. It's just going to stop. What do you think, Robbie?
Well, where we're at, it looks like we've got a 4-day war that's already an 8-day war. It looks like we're a little bump in oil prices is now a very big bump in oil prices. We used to laugh for the last couple of years and say the Americans spent 20 years, $10 trillion and thousands of lives to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. Now they've had this war, they've started this war to replace Ayatollah Khamenei with Ayatollah Khamenei. So it's clearly a disaster. You can tell, I can tell at least by the tone of the American propaganda machine, which is the Trump White House, the spokesman for the White House and Fox News, that while the words coming out of their mouth is that this is going well, you can tell by their tone it's not. It's increasingly shrill, it's hysterical, and all their words can't hide that. Donald Trump is clearly a madman. He's not Joe Biden mad in the sense of dementia. He has serious other problems, and remember the guy is 80 himself. And so you asked that question, where's who can pull it back from the brink? I don't know. I would hope that we can put a fire under the Australian government, though, because I find it personally shameful that the very first, thanks to the time zones, the very first national leader to endorse this war was this spineless, pathetic weasel that we have as a prime minister named Anthony Albanese. And the reason I'm calling him that, and showing no mercy is because 20 years ago, he was one of the strongest voices in the Australian Parliament against the precedent for this war, which was the Iraq War. And he was sort of fire and brimstone in the Parliament about, denouncing the war that broke international law. And now that he's the Prime Minister, he has endorsed an equally serious international war crime. And if he hadn't have done that, Mike, the question is, would it have changed the balance of things just a little bit? Because within hours of him doing that, as European leaders were reluctant, or some of them at least, were reluctant to endorse this war, Anthony Albanese's endorsement was being used against them to shame them into line. And of course, the Spanish held out a bit, and we heard what Donald Trump said about them, right? He said he was going to use their bases anyway. The Americans have no respect for sovereignty whatsoever. But if Australia ever grew a spine and ever called out one of these actions, we have a special place in the American psyche, our country. We're Crocodile Dundee. We're the little Aussie battlers. We've always been loyal to them, always been there with every war for over a century. And if the American government ever had to explain why the Aussies weren't backing them, that would strengthen the position of the anti-war people in America and in MAGA. MAGA is riven over this, right? So, but he hasn't done it. And consequently, as far as I'm concerned, the consequences for Australia in the petrol crisis, the fuel crisis, because we only have 35 days of fuel reserves in this country, all of them, I'm not blaming Trump for them, I'm blaming Albanese. All of them are on him because of his endorsement for this war.
Vicky, what do you think?
Well, I look at it from an economic viewpoint, and it's clearly not very good news. There have been already forecasts that this is all, if it lasts, continues to be as bad as we've seen, and oil prices continue to rise. They're now over $100 a barrel, for both WTI crude and also Brent crude. Then that will mean lower growth in the world economy, and of course higher inflation and higher interest rates, which isn't good for the consumer and isn't good for industry either. So I think, as we just discussed at the very beginning, it's really how long it lasts. Is it going to be leading to this prices staying there for quite some time and even going higher? And if that is the case, then all the forecasts that we've seen recently of some slight improvement happening in the world economy in 2026 are going to have to be rethought.
And Bertie, thanks for joining us, and I admire your willpower. What is it? Is it what, 2:15 in the morning?
It's 3:15.
Well, 3. But the good thing is you've just gotten home from party time. I mean, because you are in Florida.
A few hours ago, as it happens.
Never mind. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's. I think we look at the history of wars that the Anglosphere have been responsible for starting, and you don't have to look far back. None of them have quite worked out the way that they might have been intended to work out. I don't think American-led wars of this nature to change regimes are a good idea. They've never worked in favor of anything other than building up the military-industrial complex and creating havoc and chaos across the Middle East. Because actually it's just not possible for somebody to determine who should be the next leader. And as we've seen now, Khamenei's son has been elected or co-opted as the next Grand Ayatollah. So we're likely to be in a repeat stage, possibly worse. I don't think anyone's done a full analysis of him yet, but one would imagine that he's just seen his father die in office and has presumably learned from him in his youth. He's not likely to be an appeaser. So I think there's no question it's an unpleasant regime. I don't know whether we get the full story and the full facts of the level of unpleasantness and whether that's exaggerated by Western media. One hears of people who've been there recently who counter the theory that women have to wear a full veil all the time. There's evidence of women in markets where at least 50% of them in public are not wearing face veils at all, and that seems to be tolerated by the regime. So it's hard to tell how bad it actually is, but it's certainly true. It's not a pleasant regime, but that alone is not a reason, and it's also never been the only reason why these past attacks on other states, take Syria, take Iraq, take Libya, have taken place. There is one common thread, which is none of them wanted to introduce a debt-based sort of Keynesian model of central banking, which is issue currency and issue commensurate debt. That seems to be a common thread, and the prediction of 20 or 30 years ago was that Iran would be the sixth of those that the West would topple. That seems to have taken place. So to the extent to which Trump is actually in control of that is another question. You also mentioned the Straits of Hormuz and who might reopen them. They are still open. There are still vessels going through, not many. Contrary to some of the horror stories one reads, insurance is available. It's expensive, but it's available. It never hasn't been in these sort of circumstances. I think at this stage, with Brent, as I look it up, Brent is at just under $94. Sorry, WTI is under West Texas Intermediate. It's just under 94, and Brent sits at 109, 108. Those prices are not going to go up much, even if insurance is quintupled or whatever the price might be. So I don't think that's necessarily the biggest problem, but looking at the track record, we would do well to not do these sort of wars where we try to change regimes in other countries.
This is to everybody, but to Robbie, I'd like you to just give us your thoughts. The Donald Trump, first of all, the Iran thing, and you are right, Bernie, it was not a very pleasant regime. However, I found one, it goes back to 2018, couldn't find the latest. There was these reports out, one just disappeared from online. Strange that would happen. I thought it was free and open. But anyway, and it did say that there was about 85, 87% of people in Iran did not want a regime change. And the reason for that was they weren't too sure what they would get after. So they learned to live with the regime at this stage anyway. Donald Trump disagreed, and Western media and including independent media, they all got sucked in for this beautiful information operation, and that's what it is. Tell me how many bad stories you see about Israel or the Americans. You don't see very many at all, if any. So back to you, Robbie. Do you think the Gulf states, do you think the Arab states are just about fed up with the lies and the wish to become king of the universe at their expense? And can they evict the Americans, aka Donald Trump?
Well, there is a phenomenon, I think, that affects most of the Gulf states, which is they all have Shiite Muslim populations. I understand Bahrain has a majority Shiite, which is Muslim population, which is ruled over by a Sunni minority. In Saudi Arabia, there's a sizable Shiite population, and the risk that they run is because the Americans have murdered, which is the right word, essentially the Pope of the Shiite world in the murder of Khamenei, that the security of those Gulf countries is now severely threatened internally. And I did see some footage of Saudis sending in some reinforcements to Bahrain to try and shore up that regime. And then, of course, the Iranians themselves have just made it very clear that if you're going to house, this feeling of security they've had by having US bases in their countries, has now become their biggest vulnerability, because that's why they're being attacked by Iran. And of course, just as a quick aside, it's just hilarious to me that as soon as Iran did that, all the Western leaders, including Keir Starmer, accused Iran of being the aggressor, right? When, Iran didn't start the 12-day war last year, and it didn't start this war. And if you follow the nuclear issue very closely, Iran has always conformed with international law when it comes to the nuclear refinement issue. So it's Iran's enemies in America and Israel that have been the ones that have flouted international law. So whether they can evict the Americans, though, I'm not sure, because look at the poor Iraqis who would be the most inclined to evict the Americans. The Americans are still there, and the Americans control all their oil money, right? They don't have any control over their own oil revenue. The Americans control that. And that's 23 years after what I had considered until now the war crime of the 21st century. It still is, in my view, because of the consequences and the land invasion. But if Donald Trump loses his mind and commits ground troops to this fight, this will quickly make Iraq look like the cakewalk that they originally thought it was going to be.
If they put the troops on the ground, you can kiss goodbye this 4 or 5 week window they have, and Pete Hegseth should probably go back to Fox and become a second-rate news anchor because he's a second-rate Secretary of War. Vicky, if the Arab states did encourage the Americans and Donald to leave, would that be enough? First of all, could they do it? Would it be enough, though, to get to stop the war? Do you think Iran would stop? Because as we've just talked about, if they put boots on the ground, it's going to go on for a long, long time. And the complexity of war being what it is, it's going to do what it wants to do. It's not going to finish when the king of the universe decides or decrees it must. So what happens? What do we do?
Well, the politics is too complicated, and it's difficult to judge from here what the next steps might be. But remember, I mean, Donald Trump had said before that he didn't want to get the Americans involved in any wars that didn't directly sort of benefit them, if you like, in the sense that he didn't really want to put boots on the ground and have prolonged wars like some of his predecessors did. So he wants to probably stick to that if he can. But of course, there is an issue for all of us if this continues and becomes really ugly. Because, as I said earlier, on the economic front, you see already the impact that this has on sort of normal life, sort of airlines not able to get people out of various places, costs going up, jet fuel costs, not just in terms of what they have to pay, but also can they get the supply that they need. So you do get disruption in the economy for considerably longer. I don't think the American public is not going to necessarily like that, even though the US is considerably more protected from it all than the rest of us. If you see sort of where they stand by comparison to the UK, for example, which still imports an awful lot of its energy, certainly gas. What you find in the US is that it is more or less self-sufficient. And it also has considerable reserves, it seems, that it can use for the moment, by which I mean strategic reserves. In fact, there is a meeting, as we know, with the G7 today, trying to decide what to do with everyone's sort of strategic reserves that are there to ease the situation a little bit. Now, someone mentioned earlier that the weather is not too bad in the across the world right now. We have a mild, certainly over here, a mild March and likely to have a mild spring. It means that demand perhaps isn't going to be that great. But it is extraordinary how quickly any delivery extensions in terms of when you expect your goods to arrive or even your oil to arrive, then get translated, as we've seen in previous crises, almost directly into consumer prices going up quite significantly. So even in the US, that is going to be felt. So I don't think you'd have the incentive to make this very long. But how exactly it will all end, it just still leaves us all confused. And if you see the markets, I think they are still assuming that there will be some end to this. That's why the prices that are being quoted now are not as high as perhaps you would have expected. So, and including, interesting enough, gas prices, which have gone up, but nothing like what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine. So, fingers crossed on the economic side is all I can say, because of course, the sooner it all ends, the better it will be from that point of view.
Bernie, if the war goes on, they don't come to a solution. The outlook is not very pleasant, and take away the rest of the world would probably just slowly implode, and would probably if it continues, would most likely make COVID look like a walk in the park at the end of the day. For the Arab states, I'm very familiar with the airport, especially in Dubai. And when you see bombs or drones exploding on near these, double-decker jumbos, and you see the damage done to the economy. I think it's 1.1 million, 1 point something million per minute they lose. In fact, they're offering hotel rates at the moment at $9 a night, but you have to get there. And then you got to also make sure you take your flak jacket and your helmet too, especially by the pool. So it's not looking very good. What's your appraisal of that? And with the US, I don't know how long you've been there for. What's the rumblings on the street, or at a nice bar that you would go to? What are the rumblings? What's the talk about Donald Trump doing what he's doing?
Yeah, I don't think that. To be honest, I don't think I ever thought this was going to be a short war. And the problem with these sort of wars is that the participants or those on the edges, on the margins, find a reason to use as an excuse to settle some other scores or scratch some old sores, which leads to a broadening of the theatre of war, and then they're difficult to stop. So I think the reality is this is a war that I'd be very surprised if it's over in 6 months, possibly longer. There will have to be, and they will find a mechanism, whether it's the US Navy escorting all vessels through under its, backed by its $20 billion program to reinsure commercial markets and providing war cover, which may help a bit. The capacity is certainly there in the primary markets at a price, but the volumes will go up and be quite significant because of the higher price, for one thing. But I don't see it likely that this will be over in a bit. And I would respectfully disagree with Robbie Barwick on the question of would it have made a difference if more European leaders had stood up against Trump. I don't think it would have made the blindest bit of difference at all. The West is so in hoc to the largest military, the largest economy in the world, depending on how you measure China, that I think it's unrealistic that anything could have been done to stop him doing what he wanted to do. So I think we're in for a rocky ride. I don't think that he will find it easy after his midterm elections, when he will lose certainly one of the houses, which will make it difficult for him to pursue some of these things. And I think that's probably why he was in a bit of a hurry to get this one started before those. So I think there will be opposition to any similar moves. But of course, once you're in the war, the House is not going to disagree with any measures taken to try to alleviate the commercial and economic pain caused by it. So I would expect his tone to be more moderate after the midterms. Of course, he doesn't care about not being re-elected. I think if he ever thought he would be or could be, I think he's probably given that thought up. But I think it makes sense from an economic perspective and a political or geopoliticonomic, as I would call it, perspective to assume this isn't going to finish in a hurry and make alternative arrangements. And talking of weakly livered politicians, if Starmer pulled his finger out and decided that we should use our own North Sea oil and gas in the UK rather than buying it from the Norwegians, taken out arguably from UK oil fields and gas fields, we wouldn't be in so much of a problem either.
Yeah, Robbie, what Bernie said was quite interesting and alarming. Bernie mentioned that they are prepared and would have acknowledged that it would take at least 6 months, or the war would go on for 6 months at least. Here we are in Australia, we're already starting to panic. And we're into it only by a week and a bit, maybe 2 weeks if you look at the preempting and the beating of the chest.
Oil is the new toilet paper.
Tell me, do we use oil or windmills for toilet paper? Because one would create enormous damage, which is happening to our economy at the moment. Tell me, we have Easter not too far down the track. If we have no oil or limited oil at extravagant prices, and probably government will step in and say, we have to keep these for emergency services. How do you think Easter's looking? Do you think if you were a bunny, do you think you'd be popping your head out with a chocolate egg? Not
Well, for the benefit of your audience, Mike, you might know some of this, but uh, people might be surprised at just how vulnerable Australia is. So
Mm.
the International Energy Agency minimum for a strategic oil reserve is 90 days. And that includes oil that's on ships on the way to your country. That's counted in that. Australia has 35 days, and that's actually fractionally up from some lows we've had before. Now we had under the previous government before Albanese was elected, the Morrison government, the relevant minister, energy minister Angus Taylor, is now the leader of the opposition. You may remember he made a big announcement that he had boosted Australia's strategic oil reserve, and he boosted it by buying 1.7 million barrels of oil. But that oil was kept in the United States. It was included as part of America's strategic, which was just with our name on it. So not that was going to help us very much. However, it turns out it was also a pathetic amount because Australia's daily consumption of oil is 1.1 million barrels. So buying an extra 1.7 million barrels is a bit of a joke. That's less than 2 days extra. And that's if as the straits remain closed, this is really starting to worry that it has broken out in a toilet. I presume the toilet paper panic was not just unique to Australia. It might have been something that happened in COVID around the world, but it certainly was one of the defining features of the COVID panic in Australia. Everyone trying to buy toilet paper. So people are you know, people and businesses, farmers, etc., already reporting they can't get fuel. Now you said about Easter and the government putting on restrictions. Well, it turns out, and I actually happened to meet with him yesterday, former Senator Rex Patrick, who is Mr. Transparency in the Australian media landscape. He's been a big critic of this oil reserve deficiency for a long time. He published an excerpt from a government document today that actually says the government does not have any such plans to even limit consumption like that or ration it, which is kind of strange if you think about it, because the government prefers a free market approach, and that is just to let the price rip and let the price control the consumption. So essentially the logic is let the price explode so people are forced to stop consuming petrol, and then the people who have to use it can source it, except they'll be paying through the nose for it. That's Australian government policy. It would be much better if they did ration it and actually take charge, but our government doesn't do that. So the same kind of free market approach that led to this strategic oil shortfall is going to determine how we respond to this crisis, and I think we're in for a world of pain.
And it's terrifying too, because I can see Chris Bowen there, Robbie, clapping his hands. Everybody should get a EV.
That is what they're saying. The fuel security measure is electric vehicles, which I can understand at one level, but it's not going to keep the trucks running on the roads, which is where the economy will break down.
Yeah, Chris Bowen, I mean, I saw him out there with the shovel building his own windmill in his backyard. I mean, he's not going to be worried at all. Or is that to bury the Prime Minister? Maybe a bit of both. What would you prefer? They bury the Prime Minister or he builds a windmill?
Now, we have laws against making such observations now, Mike. You know that as well as I do, so please don't try.
It's a terrible thing to happen to a Prime Minister. Vicky, sorry, we're getting a bit inbred here, I suppose. Yeah, a bit. We're just talking about a terrible Prime Minister, terrible government, but the opposition is just as bad.
Yep.
What about in London? What about Starmer? Can the UK do something about the what's looming on the horizon? Can they fix things? Can they have a word in Donald Trump's ear?
Well, politically, what we're seeing is that Europe is trying to have a single voice, but not necessarily succeeding particularly well in doing so. The question on the economic side is, again, what can be done. As I mentioned, there's this G7 meeting about the strategic oil reserves. But there is also concern about how much money there might be available, given that everyone is over-borrowed during the financial crisis and then COVID and then the war in Ukraine. Is there enough space? fiscally to be able to help companies and individuals. Europe is already talking about subsidizing energy costs again, which is what they have done in the past. And in the UK, of course, we have this energy price cap, which was just going down in April because things had been pretty stable. And then the government intervened to take away, we talked about wind farms and everything else, but it was taking away the green levy that households have to pay. So that was coming out of the bills. And that was bringing prices down, as well as a few other things like freezing transport costs, some of the transport costs in the form of rail fares in England, the regulated ones, and prescription charges, things like that would affect the cost of living downwards. And that's what the government is now focusing on. Well, all this has messed things up because the next round of increases of what households have to pay, which is determined through this, the working of this price cap, will be coming out in the summer, and the expectation now is, of course, that will be going up very significantly. What can the government do? This price cap is limited in terms of the impact across the economy. Businesses are going to be facing extra costs. Already electricity prices, as we know, in the UK are far higher than they are in Europe, and certainly something like 4 times higher than they are in the US. It's not good for growth. The government here will have quite an incentive to make sure that this is not lasting for terribly long. So whatever they can do individually, they probably cannot. I think someone said earlier that even if the Europeans had protested more, they wouldn't necessarily have been listened to. But nevertheless, having a joint voice is perhaps the best way forward on this. But how exactly they'll do this and what joint voice that would be is still a question mark, really.
Bertie, what about the insurance issue? Who can afford, what they'd be asking at the moment? And can you tell us is there a role for London? And tell us about Lloyd's.
Yes, I mean there is. There always has been. I mean, despite the gargantuan size by comparison of the US insurance market compared with London, all insurance innovations are going back to really the last century. In fact, the century before, credit insurance was invented in Lloyd's in the 1880s by an intrepid underwriter who was told he couldn't do it in Lloyd's, so he set up a company and bought the Lloyd's shop and had the workman put a window through it so that he could pretend he was in Lloyd's when he was still writing Lloyd's business, but wrote credit insurance while he was sitting in the converted Lloyd's shop. Cyber insurance, D&O insurance, credit and political risk insurance. These are all insurance lines that were invented in the Lloyd's market, but were obviously then fast overtaken, with the exception of credit and political risk insurance, which is still dominant in London. Even the American subsidiaries that write out of London write more credit and political risk out of London than they do anywhere else, even in their own home country. So the market is set and made still very much in London. The reinsurance is purchased out of London. The capacity is available. It's just there at a price. So I don't think the extra cost, it's inconvenient and unhelpful, but so is not having any. And I think the obvious thing is to make sure that oil and gas does get through. Robbie was talking earlier about how much oil and gas is left in Australia. I think the forecast for the UK was that we had 2 days left of gas. So I think it's even more acute for us, I think, and that's even more ironic given what we're sitting on. So maybe they'll start digging under Paris because that's sitting on a gas field as well. So I mean, there's there are fracking will come back up as a subject, but of course you don't do that overnight. So there will have to be solutions. The irony really for the UK is that this plays into the hands of the lunatic that we have who's in charge of energy, who wants to convert us all to green energy, has promised that prices will go down, and will have been able to say, absent this, that prices would go down, but of course they first went up tremendously when he took office. So they will argue the case that this is another good example of green energy, which is independent of these big political decisions. And of course, we'd have loved to have put the prices down, but we can't because Mr. Trump has created a world war or a regional war that's preventing us from accessing reasonably priced oil and gas. So they have a ready-made excuse for breaking yet another election promise, which won't go down very well. But in a sense, it's not dissimilar to the argument, albeit with a different background, to what happens if you, figuratively speaking, I have to be careful what I say here as well, just as in Australia, figuratively speaking, if you cut the head off the snake, what comes in its place? I'm not sure that the alternative to Starmer, which would probably be Mr. Miliband, because that seems to be what the far left wants to have, would end up being much better for us. What we need is a complete election of someone different. I'm not convinced that we should be as positive and should rejoice as much if Nigel Farage does manage to get into office, because I think his aim is largely driven by a pecuniary and a status aspect, and the uniting of the Tory party under a combination of Reform and Tory. I don't know how much he really will stick to his promises on immigration. I don't think that's really as much of a concern as his other factors. So the devil we know, and we have begun to know this devil pretty well. Any promise he makes, you can assume the opposite's going to happen. That will continue.
Robbie, you're a supporter of China. What we hear is that if someone can save the day, it would be the Chinese and the Russians. Does China now need to step in, and can they stop Iran from attacking the ships?
Well, I understand that China's ships are actually able to get through the strait. Iran's letting them through, so that's good for China. China, on the other hand, people are saying, what's China going to do? One thing that China does is, as much as possible, mind its own business. However, it does have interests there. The most interesting thing about China right now is it's preparing for a state visit by Donald Trump, and that's in a few weeks' time. Now, I was briefed today from an American source actually that all the preparatory work that goes into one of these state visits, because everything's agreed to beforehand, has ground to a halt on the American side because of this war. So I don't know if that means it'll delay the visit or if it'll go ahead, or if China is going to keep the invitation open, because maybe one thing they could do is withdraw the invitation because of what Trump's done here. But China is going to be very reluctant to destabilize Trump further, because China does value stability above all else. So anyway, I don't speak for China. When you say I support China, I support the fact that China has concentrated. The main thing I support about China, Mike, is that for the last 25 years, while America has done this kind of dastardly deed again and again and again, China hasn't. China's focused on its own economy. China has prioritized its economic development, not in a way that enriches a super wealthy 0.01% plutocracy, but in a way that's actually lifted the living standards of its people. And it values that and guards that above all else. And that is actually a good thing. And it's been a good thing for the world. It's a driver of world economic growth. It's certainly been a driver of our economy's growth. And to me, it's increasingly becoming the model for the alternative approach. If the world is a world where two powers are, heading for some kind of conflict, well, I know which side I want to be on. Don't give me this crap about values and all that kind of traditional stuff. My values are not murdering again and again and again. I saw the figure today, 38 million people in the world since the 1970s. The United States has murdered in wars, 38 million. That's not my values, right? My values is focusing on policies that can uplift the people of my country, reinforce our sovereignty, give my children a prosperous future. And the country that most represents that is the country that the Americans, the Trump administration, have tried to tell me to be afraid and hate, and I don't. And I think I'm just wondering how the rest of the world's going to look at this. I do think we do have a distorted viewpoint in the West because we saw this kind of headline in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and then in Gaza, and we're sort of seeing it now. You get these Western media that says that they have headlines like the world condemns Putin, or the world does this and the world does that. And by the world, they mean the 1/3 of the world that's part of the Anglosphere in Europe. That's what they mean. The majority of the world is not actually on that page. The majority of the world is not interested in this. The majority of the world has signed up to Chinese programs like Belt and Road and want to go in that direction of economic development. What factors does that play as this conflict continues? Will it become a factor that forces the Americans to look at a bit of reality and decide to pull out, or not?
Vicky, what needs to be done from the UK's point of view to ensure it doesn't go down the gurgler quickly? Because this could go on, for 6 months. You put boots on the ground, and they're still firing missiles at the Arab states. That's Iran. You're going to have an enormous amount of unrest there if they can't get ships through the Strait of Hormuz. You're going to have a global catastrophe. How does, and for other governments too, how does the UK government protect itself as best can?
Well, we have talked a little bit about renewables. Of course, renewables make up now quite a large percentage of what goes in to produce electricity. Not full by any means. It depends on the day. We still rely on average about 50% on fossil fuels for that. And for the rest of industry, I'm afraid, it is really electricity and gas, and which is electricity produced by oil or gas, which is absolutely essential. So the dependence on fossil fuels is still something like 80%. So it does matter hugely for the economy. We've just produced a new forecast just before the forecast was produced just before the strikes on Iran. But of course, it was delivered a few days later, and it was already out of date in terms of growth, which was expected to be lower than had been anticipated originally, or 1.1% for 2026. But inflation slowing down and wages slowing down. Well, all this is just throwing things out of the window, and one has to rethink. And the rethinking has to be lower growth, higher inflation, higher interest rates. How do you cover yourself for all that? Well, obviously, in terms of gas, we have already been importing an awful lot of LNG from the US. The US is doing well out of that. Its exports of LNG have increased very significantly over the last couple of years anyway. But it is expensive. But then, we're going to see a lot of what's going on reflected in prices. It's interesting because as you've just been discussing, the politics, I have been looking at what's made the headlines here. And there is a big article about fish and chip shops, would you believe it? Where the cost of transporting anything is fresh fish coming in from wherever, that cost is going up because, of course, freight rates going up very significantly, as we have seen, because of everything that's going on. A lot of packaging stuff to meet the environmental conditions comes from China, so that's going to be affected. And because, of course, they fry so much, deep frying, that's going to increase their cost. So I was really, really surprised that made it into a top line in City AM, which is one of the city newspapers here. So if it hits the fish and chip shops, then I can only imagine the government is going to have to take some action.
Yeah, it's
Definitely.
we think we have a bad, but Bertie, what do you think? I've just got to make mention. Can you hear us? Yes,
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
we can indeed, loud and clear.
Excellent.
Paula White-Cain, I've
Well,
got to mention her. Paula White-Cain is the spiritual advisor to Donald Trump, and she has a very checkered history. But she and I'm asking you this question because I will probably agree and be on the same page. She professes that she can speak in tongues and heal people and stuff like that. And Donald Trump is taking her advice on what should happen with the war to many occasions. What do you think of a leader of the free world that listens to someone that professes to be able to heal people and speak in tongues and has a checkered past? What would you say to that? And he's just disappeared, isn't that
I could,
great?
Mike, I'd love to field that question.
Okay, go ahead. Speak.
I'm quite familiar with Paula
Not in
White
tongues.
Kane.
Not in tongues.
I'm quite familiar with Paula White Kane. I remember distinctly back when Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran, and I'm sort of struggling to remember the dates as such, but it's sort of like just before or around 2015, mildly before that, something like that. And Ahmadinejad was regarded as one of the most extreme presidents of Iran ever. And a head of Shin Bet, or a retired former head of Shin Bet, the Israeli Domestic Security Service, said, in the face of typical Netanyahu bluster and hysteria about Iran being, 1 millisecond away from the bomb back then, because that's what he says every day, the head of Shin Bet said, Iran is a rational actor. In other words, he was looking through all this religious trappings of the Iranian Islamic regime to say, despite all that, you can actually predict Iran will make rational decisions. That's what he said, the head of Shin Bet, or the former head of Shin Bet. Well, you got to contrast that to what we're seeing now in the Trump administration, especially with Paula White Kane is just one part of it. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, is in the same mold. These are people that are pushing for a religious war. They see Iran in religious terms, and they want a religious war. And a religious war is the worst possible kind of war. It's the hardest war to ever resolve, because both sides believe that they are doing the work of God, right? And any kind of compromise flies in the face of that. And this has been actively built up in and around the Trump administration. So Paula White Kane is an absolute lunatic of a person, seriously demented with all this religious Pentecostal laying on hands craziness. Pete Hegseth models himself on old style crusaders. He has actually, and you might have seen this clip, he has actually, well, Tucker Carlson highlighted this. He's one of these people that has bought into this idea that they want to blow up the Mosque of Omar and the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, and rebuild Solomon's Temple. So that for the Christian side of it, they think then Jesus will return, and for the Jewish side of it, they think the Messiah will come. And of course, if they ever achieve that, then they would set off the religious war to end all religious wars if they actually do it. But this is the current U.S. Secretary of War. We are under sort of threat by extremely dangerous people. And I said at a meeting the other day, Australia has always been afraid to break with the United States for our security. But you start looking at these people in charge of the United States, we should become afraid not to, because they are seriously capable of triggering World War III. And you shouldn't want to say that. That should be an extreme thing to say. But I have watched America being able to talk itself into wars my whole life, especially in the 21st century. And then you overlay this religious element to it, right? Where people I was raised a Christian Zionist. I might have mentioned this to you before. I'm familiar with this type of personality. I grew out of it and left it behind. I look at these people and I think there's nothing there that they're incapable of doing, and they would even be capable of rationalizing dropping a nuclear bomb. And it is a phenomenon in the White House that has made the world an incredibly dangerous place right now.
Bernie, before you dropped out, obviously to grab a cocktail, being in Florida, the party continues. I was just mentioning Paula White Kane, sorry, and how she's the advisor to Donald Trump spiritually and has enormous influence, and she does all the, speaks in tongues and all sorts of things. He's got a very bad history too. How dangerous is it to have the President of the United States taking advice from a woman? I have to be careful what I say here because I don't wish to be under Donald's scrutiny and to be sued for $6 billion or whatever. But she hasn't got a great record. It's a very dangerous occurrence, isn't it, that she would consult and would advise Donald Trump on how to save the world. We have frozen. We're not going well. Okay, Vicky, we're going to come back to you because you're still there. And we're going to wrap this up too. What do you see happening in the next few weeks? What do we need to stop the war and the conflict from escalating? If it escalates, where to from there?
Well, look, there have already been recalculations of what inflation is likely to be. So there is a big incentive for Europe to see this, stopping soon, and not to see sort of a decline in confidence again.
I think
which we have seen before. So I don't know
before we buy.
So I don't know whether you want me to carry on because
Yes,
I can
please.
hear.
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. So, and by the way, thank you for highlighting my book, which talked about the UK sort of being in sort of relative decline particularly since we left the EU, but also, over the last few decades. But what it has left, unfortunately, the Europeans and everyone else, because of all this crisis, is with a serious issue on the borrowing front. So what's going on right now in the markets is that they are repricing what the interest rate should be for lending to governments. So those costs are coming up for everybody. And given that there was so much that was borrowed and then distributed, if you like, across the EU in particular, but also in the UK, to businesses and individuals to carry on functioning during the various crises, it has put a limit to how much more the markets perhaps would be prepared to lend or at what price. So the cost is going up, cost of government borrowing going up. It's reflected in the cost of people's borrowing for houses. So mortgage rates are going up. So there is a real incentive to prevent that from becoming too entrenched in the economy, because also growth will be affected. So the forecast for the EU are that if prices stay where they are, we're going to see inflation at 1% higher, possibly, with higher interest rates, as I said at the beginning, which is a serious issue, and consumer confidence, which was just about beginning to improve, and business confidence will then sort of go downwards again. So not good news for anybody, really, particularly given the shocks that Germany and others have had because of the war in Ukraine, particularly in terms of gas supplies. So the incentive is there, but how they will be able to influence any outcomes, without it costing in the meantime hugely in terms of extra support that needs to be given to the economy, is the big question mark.
Bertie, you're here, but your microphone's turned off, so I'll ask the question while you turn your mic on for me. With the, we're now freezing. It's starting to look like a max headroom half hour. Try unmuting your mic. I just want to ask you one question. No, he's gone. That's goodbye, Bernie.
Yeah, can you hear me?
So, Robbie, don't you disappear on me just yet. Tell me about your thoughts on where we are going to go. Are we going to get out of this, do you think, or do you think it will get much worse before it gets better?
Well, who has power over Trump? I mean, that's the question. And because if there's going to be any kind of short-term change here, that power has to be exercised. Certainly, the people who have power over Trump seem to be the ones who want him to do this war. One way we can end the war quickly is for Trump to lie himself out of it the way he lied himself into it. Just declare victory. There's nobody in history with more front than Donald Trump, who can brazenly lie. He could just end it tomorrow and say, "I won," and most of his supporters will go along with that. But is that going to happen? I don't think so. There was a vote in the US Congress to take away his power to operate without congressional authorization, and it failed. Now, but it narrowly failed. It actually came quite close to passing, because there's a rebellion in his own ranks. There's a rebellion in the MAGA networks, and if the cost of fuel continues to bite the American people, and I know our friend Bernie's in Florida at the moment. I got a briefing today from my American sources also in Florida, and he said that the fuel, just from what he has seen locally, has gone from about $2.60 to $3.40 a gallon. Now that's still lower than Australia, but nevertheless, it's a significant jump. And if that continues to happen, then there are voices in MAGA that'll be reminding the American people that Donald Trump said that he wouldn't take us into this sort of thing, right? Now, a little while ago, Vicky mentioned that Trump had said he wouldn't put American troops in a conflict, and that's true. That is what he said. But he's the one who, in the last few days, actually, as part of his crazy tweeting on Truth Social, which has sounded increasingly unhinged, he's the one who said he would happily put troops on the ground if he wanted to, because he's Donald Trump. He can do whatever he likes. He raised it. No one else raised it. He raised it. And of course, when he did, the Iranian foreign minister was interviewed on CNN and asked about that, and he said, "Well, we would welcome that, because it would be a very different proposition to troops on the ground in Iraq. Absolutely different proposition." So these things will, as success becomes more elusive, these things will mount, and hopefully, in the short term, Trump will lie himself out of it, and this thing can end. But with this religious aspect we talked about a second ago, I've got very little confidence. This may just end up spiraling into something much bigger. The ultimate solution, I think, Mike, is that Americans have to realize we're no longer in a unipolar world. We're in a multipolar world, and the Americans have to come to the table with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the big powers, and actually start to acknowledge that they do not hold all the cards here, right? And come to a settlement that can at least achieve a peaceful arrangement, and in which the world can then start moving forward.
Now, Bertie, we have you back.
Yes.
I think
Sorry about this.
Paula White-Kane, she heard what we were saying, and she's just using her magical powers. Zim Zalabim rubs the genie up, out comes the genie. Something like that. Robbie would really agree. And we have just about run out of time, Bernie. So can you just give us your thoughts on where this is going to go strategically with the US, with the Arab states that are being bombed indiscriminately at the moment, and economically? How does, just look at the UK, and you're in the US, how does the UK and maybe the US, how do we get out of this? Do we hope that Donald does what he often does? He'll claim victory in the he'll claim victory, and then things will be back to normal. Otherwise, this can go on forever, Bertie.
Yeah, I think there has to be hope that he finds an off ramp, and he's quite good at doing that, even though you can see through them quite easily. And declares whatever victory that he's previously declared over other areas where he's apparently created a peace. But I think that the notion that any of our political systems, and I would take issue with what Robbie was talking about, China, the notion that any of our political systems are fit for purpose, I think is for the birds. I would not prefer to be under the yoke of China's communist system, where they were welding people into their buildings during COVID, and creating absolute havoc for people there. That's not a system I want to live under. I think we need complete root and branch reform of our political systems. One of the reasons why I'm pro direct democracy. I think we need to start from the bottom up. How we get there is a difficult question, but we can start at a local level, and make politics relevant to the people that vote for them in the local areas, and get rid of them when they don't, and get rid of the party system by de-emphasizing it, by making sure that we do, as voters, have the power locally to get rid of our MPs if they renege on promises they've made, not because they can't achieve them because there's no majority, but because they don't even try, and give us back the power that we should have as voters to get politicians to do what they've promised to do. But that's I suppose, a medium-term aim. It shouldn't be that impossible to do. The Swiss have managed it for quite a long time, and they're not the only country that lives under it. But to answer your question, Trump will listen to what the voters say, not least because he'll want his party to, even though it may not long-term or always have been his party, but I think he'll want his party and his successors to succeed in that party. He will listen to the voters. So if there is more of a not uprising, but if there's more opposition to what he's proposing, the cost of living, I think he will respond to that. Unlike in China, where they wouldn't. So I think there's still a vestige of democracy left in Western countries, even though it's been eroded quite fast by laws put in place that seem to be eerily similar all around where we are. That I think is a route forward.
If somebody wants to find out, thank you, by the way, Bernie, and by the way, thank you for getting up very early. At least you'll get to Disney World or the Fox Centre on time. In fact, you'll be first there. If somebody wants to find out more about what you do, how do they do that?
So I'm on X at gilt__ elephant, which is GILT, and I'm on YouTube at gilt elephant without the underscore. And I'm also on the Exco of the Heart Group, although I'm in the background there. So you'll find my stuff on X and on YouTube. And
Vicky, again, thank you for getting up early, because we have Bernie up at 3 o'clock or probably 2 o'clock to have a shower and a shave to look fresh, and 10 cups of coffee or a cup of Earl Grey tea. Vicky, if somebody wants to find out more about you or on how to find out more about your books and stuff, how do they do that?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn, but also on X at Real Vicky Price, and I'm also on Blue Sky and a little bit on Instagram. So it's quite easy to find me.
Absolutely fantastic. And Robbie Barwick, you're not going to the US, are you? Soon? I would love to.
They wouldn't let me. They wouldn't let me in with my social media, Mike.
Don't you mention my name. If somebody wants to find out more about you, how do they do that?
At Robbie Barwick on X and the Citizens Report on YouTube.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much to our panel, Robbie Barwick, Vicky Price, and Bernie de Haldevang. That's it for the Protagonists in the show today. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll catch you same time, same channel, same phone box tomorrow. And once again, thank you so much for being our audience. We do appreciate it.